He never believed in love until she stole his heart. Welcome to Love's Victory, where hope always triumphs and your heart always finds a cozy place to rest. Settle back and let the story take you to the Wyoming Territory in 1875, to a small settlement called Broken Acres, where a schoolteacher's gentle spirit meets a rancher's stubborn resolve. His Unexpected Mercy, Book 1 in the Broken Blessings series, written by J.M. Spring. Chapter 1. Mercy Mays was alone in the growing quiet, enjoying the peace and the scent of chalk dust in the one-room schoolhouse where she had come to teach just a few short days ago. An October chill, already sharp in the late afternoon air, whispered through a chink in the rough-hewn wall. Mercy knelt on the floor, her simple dress brushing the recently swept floorboards. Her ink-stained fingers carefully guided a needle and thread through the torn spine of a McGuffey reader. The children had been restless today, and she'd moved their reading lesson outside, passing her own reader to each child when it was their turn to read. It was a mistake, she thought to herself now. Some of the students were too poor for shoes, and their clothes too threadbare to stay so still in the October chill. Even with the sunshine warming them from above, she'd worried. But the children were delighted, especially when she'd cut their reading hour short for a session of exercise, herding them back inside shortly thereafter. Then she'd had them stack their readers on her desk, and now here she knelt, mending the last of them. It wasn't a particularly difficult task, and not all of the books had needed repair. Heavy, purposeful bootsteps sounded on the porch, followed by the decisive opening of the schoolhouse door. Mercy, startled from her recounting of the day's events, looked up as a tall, broad-shouldered man filled the doorway, bringing a fresh wave of the autumn cold with him. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, and his brown eyes under a serious brow seemed to miss nothing. He is undeniably an arresting figure of a man, even through that stern set of his jaw. The thought had a flush warming her cheeks. "Miss Mays," his voice was direct, a touch gruff, lacking any preamble. "Wade Whittle. Mrs. Hutchins sent me. I've come to see about the school's firewood stores for the winter and assess any immediate needs for the building." His gaze flickered to the book in her hands, lingering there for a moment before sweeping the room with a critical air that made her feel suddenly like a pupil herself. It was Mrs. Hutchins, the head of the Broken Acres School Board, who had hired her, a cheery, bustling widow with graying hair and twinkling blue eyes who had made Mercy feel at home here almost at once. Mercy rose, trying for composure. "Mr. Whittle," her voice was soft, but she willed firmness into it. "Please come in. I was just—" She paused, glancing at the reader, then met his eye, attending to some necessary tasks. He gave a curt nod, his attention already on a section of the wall that looked like it might let in the wind. "Have you taken stock of the current woodpile, Miss Mays? And are there any immediate repairs you've noted that require attention before the first hard freeze?" Why does he sound like he's scolding me? I've only just arrived. He can't possibly blame me for the state of the schoolroom. She felt vexation rising at the thought and brushed it aside. He was here and here to help besides. Her voice was even when she replied, "The existing woodpile is quite low, Mr. Whittle, and the pane in the north window is loose. I've been considering how best to secure it." Then, unable to help herself, she rattled off a list of repairs that included every worried and discontented thought she'd had since taking her own first survey of the schoolroom. I am not to blame for this disrepair. She held that last thought inside and felt her face become quite hot. She did not like to imagine how very, very red her face must be now. and I was using what Griffin always called my scoldy schoolmarm voice. This last thought sent a new wave of humiliating heat through her. "I'll see to a delivery of firewood," he began, "and have one of my men look at that window pane." He paused, and she thought she detected a flicker of warmth in his eyes, along with a subtle softening of his tone with his next words. "And anything else you need to make the schoolhouse sound for winter." Mercy took a steadying breath. Somehow, Wade Whittle's reaction reminded her of the way her brother's eyes would twinkle when his teasing or some other vexation would prompt that tone. And somehow it made the man more attractive. "That would be a great help, Mr. Whittle. Thank you." He merely nodded again, his gaze sweeping over her once more as if making a final, thorough inventory. Then, with no further word, he turned and left, the door closing firmly behind him, leaving an echoing silence. Mercy breathed in another long, deep breath. The scent of leather and of the crisp, outdoorsy scent that had entered the schoolhouse with the rancher lingered faintly. She wondered if all men in Wyoming territory were quite so brusque, or if she, somehow, had already failed to meet some unspoken expectation in this raw, demanding land. Mercy Mays did not allow herself the luxury of failing to meet the expectations of others. It was, she acknowledged, one of the reasons Griffin had teased her so mercilessly during her childhood. His teasing was never cruel, and she had always expected it was to help her learn to temper her instinct, to please others into something wiser. His careful care of her hadn't warded off the trouble that sent her west, but her brother had taught her to be resilient and resourceful, had always encouraged her dreams, and so, when trouble came, she packed up her bags and headed west to chase those dreams. How long had it been since she'd heard from Griffin? His work kept him away for long stretches, but this time it seemed longer. "Is it only that I ran into trouble this time, Lord, that I left without waiting for him, that makes this particular job feel so ominous?" She crossed her arms as she prayed, feeling the worry for her brother's long absence clench her heart. "Keep him safe, Lord. Please don't let me lose my brother, too." She remained somber as she gathered her scattered mending supplies, as she made her way back to the boarding house she now called home. And as she went, an uneasy prayer welled up within her. "And help me make my way here, Lord. Help me be who the children need me to be." Chapter 2. The bell above Guthrie's general store gave a cheerful jingle as Wade Whittle stepped inside. The scent of roasted coffee, new leather, and bulk spices a familiar greeting. Sunlight cut dusty shafts through the front windows, illuminating barrels of nails, stacks of tinned goods, and bolts of calico. Mr. Guthrie, a man whose spectacles seemed permanently perched on the end of his nose, was measuring out sugar for Mrs. Peterson, his movements precise and economical. Wade nodded a curt greeting, his gaze already scanning the shelves for the axle grease and new coil of rope he needed. He saw Mercy Mays approach the counter as Mrs. Peterson bustled out of the store. The young schoolmarm looked smaller in the cluttered confines of the store than she had in the relative emptiness of the schoolhouse, her black hair secured in a simple knot at her nape, though a few errant strands already escaped to soften the line of her jaw. She held a pair of sturdy-looking boy's boots, the leather new and stiff. "Just these, Mr. Guthrie," she said, her voice soft but clear. He took the boots. "That'll be 75 cents, Miss Mays." Wade, who had paused by a display of harnesses, felt his brows draw together. 75 cents, a significant sum, especially for a schoolteacher whose salary, he reckoned, was meager at best. He saw Mercy reach into her reticule, her expression composed as she counted out the coins. "For one of your students, I presume?" Guthrie asked, his tone neutral but with a hint of his typical curiosity. Yes, for young Billy Morrison, Mercy confirmed, a faint warmth in her voice as she said the boy's name. Wade's jaw tightened. Billy Morrison, one of the homesteader's boys. He was small for his age, with a shock of unruly brown hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything. Barefoot, yes, but it was the family's responsibility to shoe their own children, not the schoolmarm's. He shook his head. Foolish woman, he thought. The boy's father wouldn't take kindly to charity. He completed his purchases, the interaction with Mercy replaying in his mind. As he stepped back out onto the wooden sidewalk, the air crisp and carrying the scent of wood smoke, he saw Miss Mays a little way ahead, walking towards the schoolhouse, the package containing the boots tucked under her arm. Before he fully realized his own intentions, he lengthened his stride, his shadow falling over her as he drew alongside. "Miss Mays," he said, his voice a shade more abrupt than he intended. She startled slightly, turning to him, her green eyes questioning. "Mr. Whittle." "I couldn't help but overhear in the store," he began, foregoing any pleasantries. "It's a generous gesture, buying shoes for the Morrison boy. But is it a wise one?" A flicker of surprise crossed her face, and she frowned up at him. "I'm not sure I take your meaning, Mr. Whittle." "Your salary, Miss Mays. It can't be substantial, and there are other children, I imagine, with needs. Where does it end?" He shook his head, gesturing vaguely. "Folks won't be thankful." They were in the schoolyard now, and Mercy stopped, turning to face him fully. The package in her arms seemed to serve as a shield. Her gaze didn't waver. "Mr. Whittle," she said, her voice still soft, yet laced with a firmness that surprised him. "I am aware of my salary, and I am aware there are many needs, but I saw an immediate one. A child who walks to school on cold ground without shoes." She simply stared at him a moment, and her eyes grew faintly tormented. "I don't seek or need thanks." He frowned. Why had he even begun this discussion? She was no concern of his, but he had hurt her somehow, and he couldn't bring himself to allow that look in her eyes to remain. "I don't doubt your motives, Miss Mays," he began, in a far gentler tone than he'd used in a long time. "I just doubt that your kindness will be kindly received." His eyes searched hers for a moment. "I meant no disrespect, I just—" He paused then, unsure of what comfort he could offer. And then young Billy Morrison himself appeared, trudging up the path toward the schoolhouse. He was, as Mercy had said, barefoot, his small feet dusty and reddened by the morning chill. He clutched a tin lunch pail and his slate, his expression solemn as he approached them. He offered a shy, "Morning, Miss Mays. Morning, Mr. Whittle," his gaze dropping to the ground. Mercy's expression softened, and the shadow in her eyes faded as she looked at the boy. "Good morning, Billy. I have something for you." She opened the package, revealing the new boots. Billy's eyes, too large for his small face, widened almost imperceptibly. He looked at the boots, then at Miss Mays, then, with a flicker of unease, at Wade. It was the look of a child unaccustomed to receiving gifts, especially ones of such value. "They're for you, Billy," Mercy said gently, "so your feet won't be cold." The boy swallowed, his gaze fixed on the boots. He reached out a hesitant hand, touching the stiff leather. Then he straightened his thin shoulders. He looked directly at Wade, then at Mercy, his small face earnest and serious. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then, with a gravity that sat oddly on his young frame, he added, "I can work for them." "I can sweep the schoolhouse extra good every day, Miss Mays, and I can fetch more wood for the stove, Mr. Whittle, if you've a mind for it. I'm a good worker." Wade stared at the boy, pleased despite himself. Should he tell them the boy's father would still see unwelcome charity in their arrangement? Mercy's eyes shone, and she placed a gentle hand on Billy's shoulder. "That's a fine offer, Billy. We can certainly find some extra tasks for you." Wade found himself hesitating, irritation filling him over his own strange behavior. "She's not my concern, not her or the boy." He left the thought where it lay and gave a curt, almost involuntary nod to them both, making his way back to where he'd tethered his horse that morning. He'd come to town for rope and axle grease. He was leaving with a crack in the armor he'd long forgotten he still wore. Chapter 3. Mercy was sweeping the schoolhouse porch when she saw the firewood. It was a crisp and early morning, only a few days after that run-in with Wade Whittle. The neatly stacked cord of firewood was far more generous than the dwindling pile it replaced. Her breath caught. This was Mr. Whittle's doing. She knew it instinctively. "He's doing it for the school board," she thought to herself. "Not for you." Her gaze drifted towards the Whittlers' ranch, miles distant, a flicker of surprise warming her cheeks, despite the autumn air. It was a practical provision, yes, but a kindness all the same. Then on the following afternoon, as her students left their diligently scratched-out sums on their slates to wander outside for recess, the rhythmic thud of a hammer drew her out along with them. There he was, perched on a ladder, his broad shoulders outlined against the pale sky as he methodically secured the loose pane she had mentioned. He worked with focus, wasting no movement, his expression unreadable from where she stood. When he glanced towards her, meeting her eyes for a fleeting moment, his face remained stern, and a strange flutter went through her. She flushed and went back inside, distracted by thoughts of him for the remainder of her day. But the next morning brought something to mind she'd rather have never thought about again, and it took her mind entirely away from thoughts of the taciturn rancher. The sheriff, finishing his usual breakfast at the Peabody boarding house, had paused by her chair and asked her to see him in his office on her way to school. His voice was low, his words polite. She didn't think any of the other boarders had taken notice, but all the same, a tight coil of unease began forming within her. Now, seated in Sheriff Tom Brady's small, orderly office, the scent of stale coffee and old paper heavy in the air, that unease blossomed into a chilling dread. Mercy let out a long, deep breath. "Miss Mays," Sheriff Brady began, his kind, weathered face serious, "I received a letter yesterday from a U.S. Marshal back east, a Marshal Albright." He paused, his eyes holding hers. "He tells me he and his wife are acquaintances of yours." Mercy's breath hitched. "Daniel Albright, her dear friend Edie's husband." "Yes, Sheriff, they are." "Marshal Albright felt it his duty to inform me. Well, to warn me that you might be in a spot of bother. He mentioned a man, a Samuel Hartwell from Philadelphia." The name of her tormentor, spoken aloud in this quiet Wyoming office, struck Mercy like a slap. Her hands clenched in her lap, the blood draining from her face. "Please, Lord." She began the prayer almost without conscious thought. "Don't let him ruin the life I've found here, the home I'm beginning to build." The sheriff continued, his voice gentle but firm. "The marshal tells me that this Hartwell fellow made unwelcome advances towards you, slanderous accusations, and that he might be of a mind to follow you." She suppressed a shiver and forced herself to meet the sheriff's eyes. "Yes, he's said as much in the past, though he didn't mention his intention to send word." Her voice trailed off. Neither had Edie mentioned it, she realized with a frown. The sheriff gave her a kind smile, and knowing he meant to reassure her, did bring some measure of comfort, even if she'd rather not have been reminded, not have ever had anyone here in her new home know why she had fled from her last. It was a wise move leaving with them, he told her, and she pulled her attention back to consider what he was saying. "I certainly hope the fool doesn't give chase." His voice was both gentle and gruff now as he continued. "The marshal provided a description of the man. and he assured me he'd send a telegram immediately if Hartwell shows up in his vicinity. He slid a folded piece of paper across the desk. Mercy stared at the paper, unable to reach for it. "Miss Mays," the sheriff began again, his voice softening further, "I don't mean to alarm you unduly. My purpose in telling you this is so you know that my office is aware of the situation. You are not alone here. If you see this man or if anyone causes you the slightest trouble, you come to me, day or night. Do you understand?" Tears pricked her eyes. Was it fear? Gratitude? It's likely both, she thought, blinking back the tears. Daniel, bless him, acting with such foresight. And this kind sheriff offering protection she hadn't dared to ask for. She managed a shaky nod. "Thank you, Sheriff. I understand." He then passed her a smaller sealed envelope. "This was enclosed. From Mrs. Albright, I believe." Mercy stared down at the letter from her friend as she waited for the children to arrive that morning, scarcely noticing the words, but letting the sight of her oldest and dearest friend's handwriting soothe her nerves. Her eyes caught sight of a few lines near the end of the letter. "I'm sorry, my friend. I know you'd rather not be reminded, rather not let anyone know of your struggles, but Daniel truly worries Hartwell will chase after you, and you are far too precious to us to leave you unprotected and alone." She sighed at first, then smiled to herself as she saw the final lines. "Do write soon and let me know all about your new home and your teaching. Is it everything you dreamed it would be? I am so pleased and so grateful that even though Hartwell meant you harm, you took the opportunity to take a step you've been dreaming of for years. It soothes the hurt over the long miles between us to know that those miles mean you are pursuing a life you've longed for." Mercy had indeed longed to go west after earning her teaching certificate, though none but Edie and her brother had ever known of such a dream. Later that day she noticed Mr. Whittle at work about the schoolhouse again. This time it was a stubborn hinge on the outhouse door, a minor irritation she'd meant to mention to Mrs. Hutchins, the head of the school board and the woman who'd hired her. She'd often urged Mercy to let her know of anything the schoolhouse needed. Mercy watched Wade Whittle at work throughout the rest of the day, even as she taught sums and listened to the children read, idly correcting them as their tongues tripped over one word and hesitated over another. Once finished with the outhouse, Mr. Whittle began a serious, methodical inspection of the roof shingles near the chimney. He puttered about the schoolhouse even after the children left, finishing one repair after another, first this day and then the next. His presence felt sure and solid, and the deep coil of tension that had arrived with the letters from Edie and her husband began to relax. Safe, she thought. Perhaps that's the first thing I'll tell Edie about Mr. Wade Whittle. Pragmatic and stern, yes, but kind too. Then she flushed. She'd barely even spoken to the man, and here she was casting cow's eyes at him through the schoolhouse window. Chapter 4. Wade had grown accustomed to the soft murmur of Mercy's voice these last days. He listened now as she guided young Tabitha Stettler through a difficult passage in her reader. He tamped the final nail into the loose floorboard near the door leading onto the porch, the thud satisfyingly solid. He tested it with his boot. It was secure. He'd seen one of the children tripping over it in a rush to the outhouse earlier, had been glad enough to find another reason to delay the end of his work here for the day. No pressing repairs left, he thought to himself. A pang of regret tightened his chest. With the schoolhouse now in good order, he ought to be back at the ranch, though truth be told, his foreman, Jed, was more than capable of managing the day-to-day, even if he did so with a friendly glint in his eyes and some good-natured ribbing about his boss's plans to help the pretty new teacher for another day. Wade stepped aside, knowing the children would be swarming out soon when he heard Mercy admonish them to be sure to mind their reading homework at home that night. Mercy stood waving at the door, a tired but gentle smile on her face. The late afternoon sun, slanting through the west window, caught the dark sheen of her hair and the slight flush on her cheeks. "All finished, Mr. Whittle?" She turned toward him then, her voice soft in the sudden quiet of the room. "Yes, ma'am. That floorboard should hold proper now." He began to gather his tools, the silence stretching. He found himself searching for something else to say. "The children and I are very grateful for all your work," Mercy said, her gaze sincere. "You've made the schoolhouse much more comfortable." He cast her a quick look. "Just seeing to what's needed." He straightened, tools in hand. Outside, the shadows were beginning to lengthen. He cleared his throat. "Getting late, Miss Mays. I'll see you to your boarding house." It was a statement more than an offer. He saw a flicker of surprise in her eyes, a brief hesitation as she reached for her bonnet and satchel. She didn't protest, however, merely gave a small nod. The walk was quiet, and he was acutely aware of her beside him, of the faint scent of lavender that clung to her. He left her at the boarding house with a simple nod. The next afternoon, Wade found himself riding towards town much later than his usual errands required. He'd spent the morning wrestling with a restless energy, the ranch chores failing to hold his full attention. He told himself it was only right to ensure Mercy got back to her lodging safely, especially with the days shortening, and he timed his arrival as the last of her students were departing. When she emerged, locking the schoolhouse door, she paused, her expression unreadable as she saw him waiting. As he fell into step beside her, she spoke, her voice lower than usual. "Mr. Whittle, She paused. "I appreciate your concern for my safety." She glanced about the quiet street, then up at him, a troubled look clouding her green eyes. "It's not far to Mrs. Peabody's from here. Your escort is quite unnecessary." He felt a smile trying to form at her very proper, almost prim tone. He didn't let it emerge. She isn't wrong. The thought mocked him, but he paid it no mind. "Town's safe enough," he began, "but trouble finds its way here as much as anywhere else." He saw those shadows in her eyes again, the ones he'd first noticed when she bought young Billy his shoes, and thought he'd been scolding her for her efforts. He'd noticed those shadows creeping up now and again as he worked the schoolhouse repairs. He studied her for a moment as she evaded his gaze. Pretty doesn't do her justice, he thought idly, then turned his attention to the words she spoke as she finally started her walk home. "People might think folks might start assuming there's something between us." Were sparking rumors worth the worry in her eyes? He didn't speak the question aloud, but found the thought troubling. Then she asked, her words barely above a whisper, "Did Sheriff Brady ask you to see me home?" Her question caught him off guard. He looked down at her at the earnest worry etched around her mouth. He thought of Tom, his old friend. Had Tom said something to her that would make her ask such a thing? Don't probe. It was more a command to himself than a simple inner thought, as if he instinctively knew prying would make her more gun-shy than she already appeared. He wasn't trying to court Miss Mercy Mays, but he had to admit that both her safety and happiness had become something of a concern for him. "Tom didn't make a request," he said quietly. He chose his next words with care. "Miss Mays," he said, his voice deliberately calm, "Broken Acres is a small town. Folks notice things, it's true, but I reckon they're more likely to talk if a man who's already present, and for whom it's no extra trouble, fails to offer a lady a proper escort home when the day is ending." He met her gaze directly. "They wouldn't assume we're courting, if that's your concern. They'd simply think less of me for neglecting a common courtesy and a neighborly duty. It's about what's fitting, that's all." She searched his face for a moment, then seemed to relax, just a fraction. A comfortable quiet fell between them then, and they continued the walk to the boarding house without further comment. Wade's eyes strayed to her profile throughout the walk. He wouldn't ask Mercy for answers, but Sheriff Tom Brody had some explaining to do. The next afternoon, Wade left Whittler's ranch early, aiming to add more wood to the schoolhouse stockpile. It wasn't strictly necessary, but it was reason enough to be present when Mercy began her daily trek home. Sheriff Brody had proved unwilling to answer his questions, though he'd shown a sparkle of mischief when he noted Wade's reddened face as he brought up Mercy. They'd been friends too long for Wade to lie about his interest in the woman, or for Tom to insist it was there when he knew his friend wasn't even willing to admit his feelings to himself yet. But Tom's demeanor had been serious when he told his friend it might not be such a bad idea to continue escorting the new teacher home, which led directly into Wade's decision to make a trip to town every afternoon so that he could top off the schoolhouse woodpile and take note of any new needs on a day-by-day basis. It was practical enough, he hoped, to forestall any further objections Mercy might offer, and practical enough, he supposed, to convince any interested party he had no other motives, barely. If he shored the notion up with the appropriate tone, he was adding the last of the freshly chopped wood to the small bundle on the porch when he heard the voices inside, and he peeked inside before he could stop himself. Mrs. Stetler, a thin woman with perpetually pinched features, was gesturing emphatically at Mercy, her voice carrying through the partially open window. "It's not proper, Miss Mays." Mrs. Stetler's voice sliced through the air. "First shoes, now breakfast? The children will come to expect such things. Their father would not approve of this charity." Wade saw Mercy's shoulders tighten, though her voice remained gentle. "Mrs. Stetler, I assure you, it's just a simple meal. The children were hungry, and—" "Their hunger is not your concern," Mrs. Stetler cut in. "We may not have much, but we provide for our own. I won't have my children becoming beggars." Wade sighed. He'd known this moment was coming. Should I have tried harder to warn her? He wondered to himself. He couldn't help but notice how Mercy's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them before her, how she held her chin high despite the woman's reprimand. "I understand your pride, Mrs. Stetler," Mercy said softly. "Perhaps we could consider it part of their schooling. Good nourishment helps young minds learn better." Mrs. Stetler huffed, adjusting her worn shawl. "Just see that it doesn't continue, Miss Mays. Good day to you." With that, she turned and marched out, nearly colliding with Wade as she exited. Her eyes narrowed as she recognized him. "Mr. Whittle," she acknowledged stiffly before hurrying away. Wade entered the schoolhouse, his tools in hand. Mercy's cheeks flushed as she realized he must have overheard. "Mr. Whittle," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "I didn't realize you were here." He studied her face. "Been checking the woodpile. Thought it'd be easier to tend it day by day." He found himself not glad that she'd just been scolded, but glad the scolding was distracting her full attention from his somewhat flimsy logic. She looked away, busying herself with straightening papers on her desk. "Mrs. Stetler has her opinions." "Most folks around here do," he replied, then hesitated before adding, "You're making quite a habit of providing for the children." Mercy looked up then, a flash of defiance in her green eyes. "Is that disapproval I hear again, Mr. Whittle?" He found himself almost smiling at her spirit. "Just an observation." She sighed, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "The Stetler children were hungry. I simply had extra biscuits and preserves this morning." She paused, then met his gaze directly. "Mr. Whittle, I feel I should clarify something. When you cautioned me about my salary before, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not as constrained as you might imagine." Wade raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I have some independent means," she continued, her voice quieter now. "My father left me a modest inheritance. It allows me certain freedoms that my teaching salary alone might not." Wade considered this revelation. It explained some things about her generosity, he supposed. "Still," he said, moving to help her tidy the schoolroom, "folks here are proud. They don't take kindly to charity, no matter how well-intentioned." "So I'm learning," she replied with a rueful smile. "Maybe you need to find a way to make it seem less like giving and more like an exchange of some sort." He reached out to stop a reader from toppling off her desk. "An exchange," she repeated. "Something practical," he continued. "Like with young Billy and his boots. Work for compensation, dignity preserved." Mercy's face was full of obvious exasperation. "Mr. Whittle, are you suggesting I find chores for hungry children before feeding them?" He glanced up, amused by her indignation. "I'm suggesting you think like these people think. Pride's sometimes all they've got." She stood quietly for a moment, considering. "I suppose you have a point," she conceded finally, "though it seems unnecessary when simple kindness would suffice." "Simple kindness is rarely simple out here," he replied, holding the door for her as they headed out into the cool autumn evening. "Winter's coming. Can't feed every hungry child in Broken Acres." The air grew cooler as they began their walk, and Mercy seemed distracted, almost subdued. Was she still worried about that kerfuffle with Mrs. Stetler? He found himself speaking before he'd fully formed the thought. "You seem rather pensive this evening, Miss Mays. Did I offend you with my suggestion?" She looked up, a small, almost startled smile touching her lips. "Not at all, Mr. Whittle. Perhaps just the day's work settling in." She paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the satchel she carried. "Or perhaps it's the season. Autumn always makes me think of family." Wade watched her, a knot tightening in his own chest. He knew little of her family, only that she was from back east and had a brother. He wasn't a man for prying, but her wistful tone invited something more than his usual gruff silence. "My father passed some years ago," she said softly, her gaze distant, fixed on the dusty path ahead. "He was a good man, a scholar. He would have liked this little school, I think." Her voice caught almost imperceptibly. "And I never knew my mother. She died when I was born." It was a stark statement delivered without self-pity, yet it resonated with a loneliness that pricked at something within him. He imagined that kind of loss, a mother's absence from the very beginning, might leave a mark on a soul, a constant, unspoken question. He thought he saw a hint of it in the earnest way she threw herself into caring for the children, in her quiet acts of mending and providing, as if she were trying to fill a void, to prove something. As if sensing his scrutiny, she gave a small, self-conscious shrug. "My brother Griffin, he's older. He looked after me a good deal. He's a Pinkerton detective now." A touch of pride entered her voice. "He travels a great deal, of course. Autumn has always been his favorite season." A Pinkerton, mused Wade. That was a dangerous line of work. It explained some of the steel he'd glimpsed beneath her gentle exterior. She'd need to be strong to bear up under the worry of a loved one living in the shadow of danger. He found himself wanting to ask more about her brother, about this life she'd left behind. Why had she come all the way to Broken Acres, a woman of some independent means, to teach in a rough frontier town? But as he opened his mouth, he saw a subtle shift in her posture, a slight drawing inward, a familiar guardedness settling over her features. The moment for more from her was gone. But perhaps he could offer something of himself instead. The silence stretched, and the compulsion to fill it was foreign and unsettling enough for him to make it stretch a little longer in his hesitation. "My own father," he began finally, his voice rougher than he intended. "He wasn't a scholar." He cast her a quick, crooked smile, pleased when she smiled back at him. Then his own smile faded as he looked away. He was a farmer and a gambler. The admission cost him. He hadn't spoken of this to anyone in years, not even Tom Brady, though he'd shared much of his past with the other man. Not long after he first rode into Broken Acres, they'd both been little more than youths then. He gambled on people mostly, always believed the best of folks, even when they didn't deserve it, loaned money that never came back, sank everything into doomed ventures, always chasing a dream on the back of another man's empty promise. He felt, more than saw, Mercy start beside him, felt her gentle gaze on his profile as they continued, slowly, toward Mrs. Peabody's. "My mother," his voice trailed off, and he had to force the next words out. "She never recovered from it. The loss of the farm, the shame of it. She died not long after. Of a broken heart, I reckon." He looked away, towards the darkening line of the horizon, the words leaving a bitter taste. The silence was broken by the distant call of a night bird. They had slowed to a near stop now. When he finally chanced a look at Mercy, there were no platitudes on her face, no easy murmurs of sympathy, just a deep, quiet understanding in her green eyes, a sorrow that mirrored his own. She didn't speak, didn't offer comfort he wouldn't have known how to accept. She simply looked at him, and in that shared gaze, he felt a gentle thread connecting them. They reached her boarding house, the light from the window spilling onto the porch. He cleared his throat. "It's late, Miss Mays." She nodded, her eyes still holding that soft, understanding light, as if he was a puzzle she'd finally put together, found it still had broken pieces and was determined to heal each and every one. "Yes, Mr. Whittle. Thank you for your escort, and for sharing." She smiled shyly then, pausing for one last moment before slipping inside the boarding house, and for listening. He stood there alone a moment before striding back toward the ranch, giving the sheriff an idle wave as Tom passed by. Likely headed to the boarding house for dinner. He ate there most evenings. Wade Whittle was no more willing to lie to himself now than he had been to his old friend earlier. His feelings for Mercy were growing stronger, day by day. Haven't known Mercy Mays a full season yet. Shouldn't be seeking her tales. Shouldn't be sharing my own. There was a certain grimness in his thoughts. "This is how it starts, isn't it, Lord?" His voice was quiet as he spoke into the night. He wouldn't let himself call it a prayer. It had been a long, long time since he had prayed, since he'd been willing to admit to himself how much he needed the Lord. Somehow he didn't think he'd be able to hold on to the notion much longer. Chapter 5. A few days later, Mercy Mays stared in wonder at the small, crumpled telegram in her hands. Her heart suddenly light as a feather. The paper trembled between her fingers as her eyes traced each word again. "Be there soon. Stay safe. Proud of you. Griffin." Griffin was coming. Her brother was alive. The relief that flooded through her made her realize just how deeply she'd been worrying. It had been too long since she'd heard from him, and with Samuel Hartwell's shadow seeming to stretch all the way from Philadelphia, she'd felt more alone than she cared to admit. She felt a smile forming. Not so alone now, she thought joyfully. Griffin will be here soon. Miss Mays. Billy Morrison was practically bouncing on his toes before her desk, his newly booted feet making soft thuds against the wooden floor. His eyes were wide with excitement, cheeks flushed from his run. Did I deliver it proper? The man who brought it, he came on horseback, all dusty from the trail. He asked for you at the general store, and Mr. Guthrie pointed to me and said I could bring it since I was heading to school anyway." Mercy smiled, touched by his enthusiasm. "You delivered it perfectly, Billy. Thank you." She carefully folded the telegram and tucked it into her pocket. She looked at the boy, then impulsively shared her news. "My brother Griffin will be arriving soon," she said, her eyes shining. "Is that what the telegram said?" Billy's voice was full of awe. "Telegrams sure are nice, ain't they, teacher?" She smiled at the child's pronunciation of the word. "This one certainly is. I'll tell you something, Billy. My brother Griffin is a Pinkerton detective. I'll share some stories about the Pinkertons with the whole class later." Billy's eyes went wide and he opened his mouth to speak, only to turn away as other students began trickling in and settling into their seats. It was Yancey's turn to ring the bell, and he was doing so now. "School's startin'," he hollered. Billy turned back toward her and shifted his weight from one foot to the other, suddenly looking shy. "Miss Mays," my ma wanted me to ask. "She wonders if you might come to supper tonight." He ducked his head slightly. "She's making her rabbit stew with dumplings. It's real good." The invitation surprised her. After the chilly reception her attempts at charity had received from many of the other parents, Mercy hadn't expected such warmth from the Morrison family. "That's very kind of your mother, Billy. I'd be delighted to come." Relief and happiness broke across Billy's face. "Pa says I should walk you home with me if you want." His enthusiasm and confidence had returned, with her easy acceptance of the dinner invitation. She smiled at him. "That would be lovely," she began. "Now settle into your seat and we'll begin the day's lessons." Griffin is coming soon, she thought again. That knowledge still filled her with a warm joy. And tonight she would share a meal with the Morrisons. Perhaps Wyoming wasn't so very different from Philadelphia after all. People could be proud and difficult anywhere, but they could be kind too. She pulled her focus back to the day's lessons, deciding to start the day with some brief details about Griffin's work. She stood before the students. "Now, who can tell me what a detective does?" Mercy asked, watching her students' faces light up with interest. "They catch bad guys," Oscar Stetler called out, making a pistol shape with his fingers. "They solve mysteries," said Yancey Stone, the oldest boy in the class at 13. His tone was more measured, trying to sound grown up. "Both of those answers are correct," Mercy said, smiling. "Today we're going to learn about a special kind of detective called Pinkertons." She turned to the blackboard and wrote the word in her neat script. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency was founded by a man named Alan Pinkerton. These detectives help solve very difficult crimes that might be too challenging for local sheriffs to handle alone. "What kind of crimes, Miss Mays?" Oscar asked, leaning forward eagerly. "Well, they might track down train robbers who move from territory to territory," she explained. "Or they might investigate bank robberies or help find missing people or stolen property." She drew a simple eye on the blackboard. This is their symbol, an eye, and their motto is, "We never sleep." She wrote the words beneath the eye. It means they're always watchful, always observant. "Like they got eyes in the back of their heads?" little Opal Anderson whispered, her own eyes wide. Mercy smiled gently at the shy child. "Not exactly, Opal. But they are very good at noticing things other people might miss." "Do they get into big gunfights, Miss Mays?" Yancey asked, his expression eager despite his attempt to appear nonchalant. "Sometimes they do face dangerous situations," Mercy admitted, thinking of Griffin and the worry that had gnawed at her these past weeks. "But most of their work involves careful observation, gathering information, and working closely with local lawmen like Sheriff Brady." "Does your brother wear a star like Sheriff Brady?" Billy asked, his voice filled with awe. Mercy shook her head. "No, Billy, Pinkertons don't wear badges like sheriffs do. Sometimes they even work in disguise, what they call shadow work, to gather clues without anyone knowing they're detectives." "So they're like secret spies," Oscar breathed, clearly enthralled by the idea. "In a way," Mercy conceded, "though they're always working to uphold the law, not break it." Opal raised her hand tentatively, her voice barely audible when Mercy called on her. "Do they help people who are scared, Miss Mays?" The question caught Mercy off guard. She thought of the telegram in her pocket, of Griffin's promise to come soon. "Yes, Opal, they do. They help people who are afraid, who need protection. That's one of the most important things they do." She continued the lesson, explaining how Pinkertons often traveled great distances to solve cases, how they kept detailed records of criminals, and how they used new scientific methods to catch wrongdoers. The children listened, rapt, peppering her with questions that she answered patiently. She watched the children leaving after their final lesson, all but Billy, who hung back to bring her home with him. They still chattered about the Pinkertons as they left for the day. Mercy smiled faintly. Their excitement over her impromptu lesson had bubbled over in excited chatter for the entire day. "Perhaps I'll plan similar vocational lessons for the future," she thought, recalling their shining eyes and enthusiasm with fondness. Then, as she began gathering her things, her thoughts turned once again to her brother's pending arrival. Griffin would have enjoyed hearing about this lesson. Even with his near-constant teasing, he had always been deeply supportive of her dream to teach, despite her lack of financial need for a profession. He would have loved to see their earnest, eager little faces as their questions spilled forth, she thought wistfully. Then she nearly laughed at herself. "You silly goose," she thought. "He'll be here soon enough, and maybe he can be persuaded to stop by one morning. No, on an afternoon. If he stops in for a brief visit to share some of his stories during morning classes, the children will never settle down." Mercy smiled as she locked the schoolhouse door, wrapping her shawl tightly against the chill. Billy, who had been skipping stones in a puddle near the road, spotted her and came running. "Miss Mays, are you ready to come to supper?" His excitement was palpable. "It seems I am," Mercy said, smiling at the boy. As she rounded the bend in the road, she was surprised to see Wade Whittle walking toward her, his long strides eating up the distance between them. He nodded in greeting, his expression unreadable as always. "Afternoon, Miss Mays." "Mr. Whittle," she acknowledged, feeling that now familiar flutter in her chest. "I was just heading to the Morrisons for supper." "As it happens, so am I," he replied. "I've got some business with Abel Morrison I need to discuss." Mercy raised an eyebrow. What a coincidence! She wasn't really surprised. Wade had been shoring up the ever-growing stockpile of wood for the schoolhouse, showing up every afternoon. She smiled to herself. And just so happening to be on hand, to wander alongside her as she made her way home to Mrs. Peabody's each school day. She had offered no further objections, and he had made no improper advances, nor any proper ones, she thought ruefully. Neither had they talked of anything deeply personal beyond that first discussion. But they did speak together, she filling him in on the funny moments of her day, he sharing small details about the town. And sometimes they walked in easy silence, content to simply share the peaceful evenings together. They walked together in companionable silence now, exchanging occasional smiles as Billy chattered happily between them about the day's Pinkerton lesson. Mercy was acutely aware of Wade beside her, of how his presence seemed to fill the space around him. Despite their recent conversations, he remained something of a mystery to her, stern and practical on the surface, yet capable of unexpected kindness. As they approached the Morrison homestead, Abel Morrison emerged from his fields, wiping his brow with a bandana. He looked surprised to see them both. "Miss Mays, just as Billy promised," he said with a nod, then turned to Wade with raised eyebrows. "Whittle, didn't expect to see you out this way today." Wade stepped forward, extending his hand. "Morrison, hope you don't mind the intrusion. I was wondering if I could impose upon you folks for dinner tonight. I've a business proposition for the two of you I'd like to discuss." Abel's weathered face registered surprise, but he clasped Wade's hand firmly. "Well now, any proposition that brings the likes of Wade Whittle to my table must be worth hearing." He glanced curiously between Wade and Mercy, but asked no questions. "You're both welcome at our table." He turned to his son with a smile. "Billy, run ahead and tell your mother we'll have 2 guests for supper instead of 1. Billy took off like a shot, clearly delighted by this turn of events. "Business proposition?" Abel asked Wade as they walked towards the modest homestead. Wade nodded. "I've been thinking about the school board renting some of your farmland to grow extra crops, having Callie prepare those crops as a daily breakfast for the children and school teacher." Abel's eyebrows rose as Wade continued, his voice matter of fact. "A properly educated child grows up to be an asset to the whole town, and a proper meal is a good start to a day's learning. The school board ought to supply the teacher and students with that meal, seeing as how the whole town gets the benefit." Abel stroked his beard thoughtfully, a twinkle appearing in his weathered eyes. "That's not a bad notion, Whittle. And I reckon parents could pitch in any foodstuffs they might have that would otherwise go to waste." Mercy walked beside them in stunned silence, her mind racing. Did Mr. Whittle plan this to help me? She wondered. The plan was sensible, even ingenious, and it was so very like the man she was seeing him to be. No one's pride would be wounded, as everyone would contribute something. The children would be fed. The school would thrive. She frowned, thinking back to when they'd first arrived, specifically to the way he'd phrased his request. He asked if he could impose upon them for dinner. Was it part of his plan? Had he offered a carefully crafted request implying a favor in order to disarm any objections their pride might throw at him? She felt a wave of mortification wash over her. "There's no real fault in his actions or his words," she told herself firmly. That only made her feel worse. Just how much of the resentment that the mothers of her school children poured over her had he heard? She felt tears stinging her eyes and tried desperately to will them back. When Callie Morrison appeared on the porch with Billy bouncing excitedly beside her, something inside Mercy snapped. Without warning, her scoldy schoolmarm voice, the one Griffin always teased her about, burst forth. "I don't know which is worse, that one man fails to accept charity or that the other fails to initiate it." She glared from one man to the other as the words hung in the crisp autumn air. Her temper had chased away her tears, mostly. Horrified at her outburst, Mercy stalked past them to the farmhouse stoop, where she stopped short, not quite brave enough to enter without invitation after such behavior, not wanting any of them to see if her humiliation pushed forth the tears once more. She felt someone come up behind her, felt a soft hand on her shoulder. When she spoke, Callie Morrison's voice was gentle. "Come in, Miss Mays. Supper's almost ready, and we're mighty pleased to have you." Chapter 6. Wade watched Callie lead Mercy into the farmhouse with mixed emotions. He found himself a bit bothered by Mercy's criticism. Was preserving dignity when offering help such a bad thing, he wondered. "That's quite the teacher's voice Miss Mays has," Abel said with a solemn tone. Wade cast a glance at him, noting the gentle twinkle in his eyes, and knew he was merely attempting to lighten the mood. Billy nodded an immediate agreement, piping up in a solemn tone that mimicked his father's. It works real good at school, too." Wade smiled at this and felt the tension draining out of him, though he was still concerned over those tears he'd detected in Mercy's eyes earlier. He, Abel, and Billy moved to follow the women into the house. They heard Callie's voice, though it sounded faint as it drifted back to them from the house. "Is it all right if I call you Mercy? I'd sure like it if we could be friends." Abel stopped dead in his tracks then. He even reached out to stop Wade and Billy from entering. As Abel ushered them toward the nearest field, Wade could hear Callie call out behind them, "You menfolk go find something useful to do." They stopped there, and Wade gazed out at the field, his eyes picking out the stubble from harvested wheat, listening idly as the other man spoke. "My Callie took preacher's sermon a few weeks back real serious. You know the one? It was about friendship," began Abel. "You know that verse?" He waited expectantly. Wade gave the other man a blank stare, then raised an eyebrow. "Faithful are the wounds of a friend," Wade supplied. Abel frowned at him, and Wade shrugged. "I don't know the exact chapter and verse either. What's your—" Wade's voice trailed off. "Oh, Callie would be making some opinions firmly known tonight." He frowned, then shook his head. "Don't see what you kicked a fuss up for," he said. "Callie's a kind woman. Even if she states her piece, there won't be anything hurtful in it." Wade didn't feel as confident as he sounded. Mercy seemed to be hurting plenty already. Abel sighed. "No, my Callie won't be hurtful." They were all quiet for a moment. Both men became aware of Billy's curious gazes at the same time. He'd glance from Wade to his father, then back to the house. Then he'd start the cycle over again. "Son," began Abel, "don't you be pestering Miss Mays with awkward questions later, understand?" His tone made it clear there was no room for argument, and Billy nodded, his shoulders slumping. He cast a sad, wide-eyed glance up at Wade, who nearly couldn't hold back a smile as he answered the child's pleading gaze. "I won't be pestering Miss Mays with awkward questions either," he said in a tone of absolute sincerity that had Abel smirking at him over his son's head. "But if I happen to hear anything," he continued shamelessly, "I'll let you know." He paused. "If I think your pa would find it appropriate to share," he added. Abel choked back a laugh and shook his head at Wade. They slowly wandered back toward the house, quickening their steps when Callie called the menfolk for dinner. The aroma of rabbit stew and fresh-baked biscuits greeted them as they entered the small but tidy kitchen. Wade noticed immediately how Mercy's eyes were slightly reddened, though she smiled warmly as they entered. Callie bustled about, placing steaming bowls on the table, her movements efficient and practiced. "Just in time," she said cheerfully. "Sit yourselves down before it gets cold." Wade took the seat across from Mercy, trying not to stare at her. The lamplight caught the glossy black of her hair, and despite the earlier tears, there was a certain peace about her now. Whatever Callie had said seemed to have soothed rather than wounded. "I must apologize," Mercy said suddenly, looking first at Wade and then at Abel. Her smile was wry as she continued. "It was a rather uncharitable assessment of your characters." Wade watched her carefully. It didn't surprise him that she didn't seem to think her assessment had been altogether fair. It didn't make him feel much better either. Something was pricking at her beneath the surface, but he couldn't protect her from an unseen enemy. Abel waved her remark away, his weathered hand making a dismissive gesture. "Don't you fret about that, Miss Mays. Wade here's always had a way of finding ready work where there was ready need, and most folk always saw it for the charity it was." He paused to take a spoonful of stew. "Ain't so different as you allowing Billy to work for his boots, or your coming to dinner on short notice to allow us to thank you as much as to welcome you to town." Mercy's eyes dropped to her plate, a wistfulness crossing her features. "I just want so much to be what the town needs," she said softly. When she looked up, her eyes collided with Wade's, and he watched a flush spread across her cheeks before her eyes fluttered down to her plate again. "The children seem to feel you're doing just fine," Callie assured her, passing the biscuits. "Billy talks of nothing but school these days." Abel nodded, his eyes glinting with mischief. "That's the truth. Why, he was telling me and Mr. Whittle earlier how your teacher voice was real good, and we both thought so too." Wade watched, captivated, as the faint blush on Mercy's cheeks grew stronger. She laughed softly, the sound warming something deep within him. "My brother Griffin called it my scoldy schoolmarm voice," she confided, leaning forward slightly toward Billy, who was watching her with rapt attention. "When I was a little girl, I used to scold my dolls with that voice. It was always more fun to play at scolding naughty dolls than teaching them." Billy's eyes widened with fascination at this glimpse into his teacher's past. He gazed at her with pure hero worship, then suddenly dropped his spoon with a clatter. "Teacher, your brother is a Pinkerton, and he's comin' here." The boy's excitement was palpable. He'd obviously missed this implication earlier in the day. They all laughed, and the conversation flowed easily from there. Mercy spoke of her brother's upcoming visit, his work as a detective, and how she hoped he might stop by the school to speak with the children. "They were so excited today when I mentioned Pinkertons," she said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "I think they'd be thrilled to meet a real one." "When's he due to arrive?" Callie asked, refilling Wade's coffee cup. "I'm not certain," Mercy admitted. "The telegram just said soon. I hope within the week." The talk turned to the school breakfast plan, and Wade found himself explaining his idea in greater detail. As he spoke, he watched Mercy's expression, pleased by the approval he saw there. "It's a fine idea," Callie said thoughtfully. "I could manage the cooking easily enough, especially if the school board's supplying the food. And the children would all be treated the same," Mercy added softly. "No one singled out for charity." Wade nodded. "That's the heart of it." He hesitated, then decided to press forward with his second proposition. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you both," he said, looking at Abel and Callie. "I find myself in need of someone to cook for my household, not the ranch hands, they have their own cook, but for me. The woman who used to cook for me has moved in with her daughter to help with her grandchildren." Callie's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You're asking if I might cook for you, Mr. Whittle?" "I am," Wade confirmed, "and there's more to it than that." He turned to Abel. "You used to work as a ranch hand for me, along with working your farm before the doc put an end to it." Abel nodded slowly, a shadow crossing his face. "That I did." He looked over at Mercy. "There was a time Preacher had to use his own scoldy voice, as you call it, and I sure deserved it at the time. He said if the good Lord expects us to give, he must also expect us to receive." Wade watched Abel look over at his wife, then they both turned to look at him. "Doc says I'm better now," Abel continued, "but I ain't got what it takes to go back to my old work." Wade wasn't surprised at the news. If Abel felt up to his old work, he'd be working his own land as well instead of still renting the fields. "I need a man around the ranch to handle the little daily tasks that stack up without notice," Wade said. "Ranch work is never done, and I've got carpentry orders on top of that, and I hate my own cooking." He leaned forward slightly. "There's the small home on my property that my cook used to use. It's yours if you want it." Abel and Callie exchanged a startled glance. "And you might consider renting your house out with your land when the season ends, and your lease to the current renter closes," Wade added. "Might be worth more to a man if he could live here while he worked the land. might work out a mighty good deal to benefit both parties. Wade deliberately didn't look at Mercy while making this suggestion, not sure he was ready to see how she felt about these ideas. When he finally did catch her eyes, he was warmed by the glow of approval he detected. "It's a generous offer," Abel said slowly, his hand finding Callie's across the table. "We'd need to discuss it between ourselves, of course." "Of course," Wade agreed. "There's no rush." As dinner wound down, Abel insisted on hitching the wagon to take them into town. "It's getting dark and the path can be treacherous in places," he said firmly. Billy begged to come along, and soon they were all settled in the wagon, bumping along the rutted road toward Broken Acres. The night air was crisp, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Wade sat beside Mercy on the wagon bench, acutely aware of her warmth beside him, of the subtle scent of lavender that always spoke to him of her presence now. They didn't speak, finding themselves listening to Billy's chatter as they had so much throughout their evening together. He was winding down now, Wade noted, every other word a yawn. He exchanged an amused glance with Mercy, and a wave of tenderness washed over him as he held her gaze for one long, unending moment. What would it be like to have a son like Billy, Lord? He scarcely noticed that this thought was a prayer as he continued to gaze at her, watching a flush staining her cheeks again. Seeing her own gaze flutter shyly away made him realize the implication of his unspoken words, and he drew in a sharp, quiet breath as heat began climbing his neck and his own face reddened. When they reached the boarding house, Wade helped Mercy down from the wagon, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary at her waist. They stood there in the quiet darkness, the sounds of Abel and Billy driving off in the wagon fading into the background. "Good night, Mr. Whittle," Mercy said after a moment, her voice soft in the darkness. "Good night, Miss Mays," he replied, his own voice rougher than usual. She hesitated, as if wanting to say more, then turned and walked up the path to the boarding house. Wade watched until she was safely inside, the door closing behind her, before he headed home himself. As he walked through the quiet streets of Broken Acres, Wade found himself thinking about the evening, about Mercy's flash of temper, about her gentle gratitude afterward, about the way her eyes had met his across the dinner table. He thought about Abel and Callie, their quiet strength and dignity, their clear love for each other and their son. He thought, too, about the speaking glances they'd shared with one another as they looked between him and Mercy. And he thought about his own solitary ranch house, how empty it felt these days, how different it might feel with Mercy's laughter filling its rooms. The next thought stopped him in his tracks. "I'm falling in love with Mercy Mays, Lord." He stood motionless under the star-filled sky. Wade Whittle, who'd sworn never to give his heart away, was falling in love with a woman whose kindness seemed boundless, whose spirit was both gentle and fierce, whose smile made him feel things he'd never expected to feel. "Lord, help me," he whispered into the night. This time there was no pretending the fervent words were not a heartfelt prayer. Chapter 7. Mercy sat at her desk, making careful corrections on a stack of arithmetic papers, her mind only half on the task. Griffin's telegram had arrived 5 days ago and still no sign of him. The initial burst of joy had settled into a steady, hopeful anticipation, but beneath it ran a current of worry. What if something had delayed him? What if he'd encountered trouble on the road? "Lord, keep him safe," she prayed silently, marking an incorrect sum with a gentle stroke. Mercy tried to confine her thoughts to her task, smiling ruefully to herself when they strayed to her dinner at the Morrison homestead late last week. She felt the heat of humiliation as she recalled her outburst. "I knew when I was scolding them, Lord, that my words, while not strictly untrue, didn't apply to either man. but she had said as much at dinner and clearly been forgiven. She only wished she could stop replaying her words and the startled flash of hurt she'd seen in Wade's eyes, over and over in her mind. Mercy sighed, setting her pen down and closing the ink bottle. There would be no finishing. She'd begin again in the morning. She'd gently lay the rock she used as a paperweight on the stack of homework. Her thoughts strayed to the following Sunday service. The preacher had been the one to pitch Wade's school breakfast plan to the congregation. Mercy had not been so concerned with her own mortification that she couldn't notice similar etchings stitched upon the congregation all around her. She'd even seen Abel cast a quick, commiserating glance her way when the sermon said what he himself had shared at dinner. What was it? I remember now, she thought. If the Lord admonishes one to give with an abundance of His grace and love, then you can be sure there exists an admonition to receive with that same abundance, and to the Lord be the glory. Not quite what Abel had said. Truth be told, Lord, I find Abel's version much easier to remember. She'd found Abel's dejected shrug during the service to be amusing enough to distract her at the time, helping her mask her unease. But the more she heard the sentiment repeated, the more she realized she wasn't giving as selflessly as she might have hoped. The preacher had been gentle, encouraging, praised the idea of a plan that encouraged the town to work together to provide for the well-being of individual members and the well-being of the town as a whole, had lauded the wisdom in receiving when there was a need, working when you were able and work was available, and being ready to give with open hands. She heard Abel mutter to Callie in the yard after services, "Only thing worse than knowing preacher is preachin' at you is knowing he's preachin' at the other guy." And then he shuddered. Callie had only laughed and said it was the preacher's way. Abel had nodded and replied, "I expect a sermon soon about it doesn't matter if none of us is right, because none of us without Christ is righteous." Mercy had returned to her pew to think and to pray, not surprised when the preacher joined her a short time later. "It wasn't aimed at you," he said softly, sitting in the pew in front of hers and then turning to face her. "I always flinch a little inside when my sermon collides with gossip, but I can't flinch away from delivering it." Though he remained gentle, there was no apology in his voice. She had smiled then, realizing the man in front of her wasn't much older than she was. "I suppose it's a sign that the Holy Spirit is at work, if your congregation feels convicted." The following talk had been short, and she had not walked away with the exaggerated trauma that Abel liked to joke about. But the preacher did have a way of bringing a crisis of faith to the forefront for immediate attention. She chuckled softly to herself. Abel Morrison wasn't the only person in town who viewed Reverend Timpson with a friendly mix of trepidation and respect. "I like the home you've made for yourself among this congregation, Lord. I like the home you're helping me to build." Reverend Timpson was the only preacher in Broken Acres. While he only served in the town alternating weeks, Mercy found she enjoyed his services immensely. But this had been the first time she'd experienced one of the sermons that she'd heard the townsfolk murmur about ever since she'd arrived. And since then, Mercy had felt a subtle shift in her relationship with the town. Mrs. Stettler had nodded to her in the general store yesterday, a small gesture but friendlier than any she'd yet received from the woman. And this morning, little Opal Anderson had shyly presented her with a handkerchief embroidered by her mother. "For your desk," the child had whispered. And then there was Wade. She propped her chin in her hands and stared, unseeing, out into the schoolroom. Wade Whittle, with his stern countenance and unexpected kindnesses. The way his eyes had held hers across the Morrisons' dinner table, warm and intent. The gentle pressure of his hands at her waist as he'd helped her down from the wagon. A flush warmed her cheeks at the memory. She'd been courted before, of course. There had been several suitors in Philadelphia before Samuel Hartwell had destroyed her reputation, but none had affected her the way Wade did, with his gruff manner concealing such thoughtfulness. Her stomach sank as she continued to think of Wade. Was it just wishful thinking? I thought he'd taken an interest in me. But maybe this is just who he always is, a generous man who hides his gifts behind carefully crafted and practical plans. He'd been distant all week when he'd walked her home. The sound of boots on the schoolhouse steps pulled her from her reverie. Heavy, purposeful steps, Wade's steps. Her heart quickened, and she smoothed her hair with an ink-stained hand before realizing what she was doing. But when the door swung open, it wasn't Wade who stood there. Sheriff Brady's weathered face was grim, his eyes shadowed with concern. Behind him stood two men, one tall and lean with a familiar stance that made her heart leap, the other a stranger with a badge pinned to his vest. "Griffin!" Mercy was on her feet in an instant, joy surging through her at the sight of her brother. But as she rushed forward, the expressions on all three men's faces stopped her cold. Griffin's face was drawn with tension and fatigue, a healing cut visible above his right eyebrow, but there was an answering joy twinkling out at her from his eyes. "Mercy," he said, his voice rough with emotion as he stepped forward to embrace her. His arms were strong around her, familiar and safe, but she could feel the rigid set of his muscles. "What's happened?" she asked as they separated, though she clutched Griffin's arms a moment until he pulled her in for another quick hug. "I'm fine, little sister. Everything is going to be fine," he murmured before releasing her again. The assurance only comforted her for a moment. He wouldn't have said it if there wasn't more wrong than what sent me here, she thought, uneasy with the realization. Her gaze moved between the three men. "Sheriff." "What's wrong?" Sheriff Brady removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "Miss Mays, your brother and his associate here arrived in town about an hour ago. They came straight to my office with some concerning news." Griffin's jaw tightened. "Hartwell's men are coming, Mercy," he said bluntly. "Two of them left Philadelphia 3 days after I did. They are headed this way." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Mercy gripped the edge of her desk, feeling the blood drain from her face. "How do you know?" "One of my sources in Philadelphia sent word," Griffin said simply. "These aren't just hired thugs, Mercy. They're Pinkerton men who've been dismissed for misconduct, men who know how to track, how to hunt." The third man stepped forward then, his expression grave. "Miss Mays, I'm Deputy Marshal James Harker. I was passing through Cheyenne on related business when I met your brother at the sheriff's office there." His voice was steady, professional. "Sheriff Brady has briefed me on your situation. I'll be staying in town for a few days to assist." Mercy nodded numbly, her mind racing. "Will I lose it all, Lord?" She couldn't think beyond that single prayer. The sound of the schoolhouse door opening again made them all turn. Wade stood in the doorway, and Mercy watched his eyes sweep the room, taking in Griffin's protective stance, the presence of the sheriff, and the deputy marshal. Finally, his eyes met hers. Her heart tightened when she saw his gaze soften. "Miss Mays," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "I came to see you home." His gaze moved to Griffin, assessing. "Mr. Whittle," Sheriff Brady said, stepping forward. "This is Miss Mays's brother, Griffin Mays, and Deputy Marshal Harker." Wade nodded to both men, his expression unreadable. "Gentlemen?" Griffin straightened, studying Wade with the keen gaze that had made him such an effective detective. "You're the rancher," he said. "The one Sheriff Brody mentioned has been escorting my sister home." "I am," Wade confirmed, his voice level. An uncomfortable silence fell. Mercy looked between the four men, feeling as though currents of unspoken communication were flowing around her. Finally, she drew a deep breath. "Mr. Whittle," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "it seems we have a situation that requires discussion." She glanced at her brother, then back to Wade. "I believe it's time I explained." Her voice trailed off weakly, but she took a deep breath and began again. "I suppose it's time I told everyone everything." Wade's eyes met hers, and there was a steadiness, a strength in his eyes. She felt herself relax under that gaze. He nodded once, then closed the schoolhouse door firmly behind him. Sheriff Brady cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should all sit down." They arranged themselves around the schoolroom, the sheriff leaning against a desk, Deputy Harker standing near the window, Griffin pacing restlessly. Wade took a position near the door, his posture alert but calm. Mercy remained standing, her hands clasped tightly before her. She looked at Wade again and felt her nerve falter. Perhaps it should have amused her that the one whose presence a moment ago had lent her strength now filled her with dread. "You're the one I don't want to tell, and you're the one I want to tell the most," she thought. She held his eyes with hers for first one heartbeat and then another before turning her gaze away. It would be easier if she didn't look at any of them. "I left Philadelphia because of a man named Samuel Hartwell," she began, her voice quiet but clear in the still room. "He was a prominent businessman there, well respected in society." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to continue. "He began to pay me particular attention at social gatherings. At first, although I wasn't particularly interested, I was flattered, and I wasn't afraid." She glanced at her brother then and suspected he had learned much of this story already. Well, she had left him letters, and though she hadn't filled in the particulars, Daniel and Edie both knew them all. She continued calmly. "He was wealthy, influential, but I soon realized his intentions were less than honorable, and when I refused his advances, he became angry. He spread rumors, outright lies, really." She paused, taking a deep breath. "Then he claimed I had attempted to seduce him, that I had tried to entrap him into marriage." The words tasted bitter on her tongue. She could not bring herself to look at Wade. People found it far more believable than I might have expected. She took a shaky breath. "Then Hartwell came to me privately. He said he would retract his statements, restore my reputation, but only if I would agree to marry him. He said no one else would have me now." She was silent for a moment. "I don't know why, but he seemed so smug, so certain I'd have no choice but to agree to marry him. The thought of staying had become intolerable to me, especially with the Albrights leaving," she said, looking at her brother. Griffin moved to her side, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "He wanted your money, your respectable place in society. But my baby sister isn't a pushover." He looked around the room at the other three men before looking back at Mercy. "It was smart, your plan. If your friends," he stopped, shaking his head in disgust, "and if not even your church family was willing to stand up and protect you, then I think leaving to fulfill your dream was a fine plan." Mercy felt a flush of embarrassment at her brother's candid assessment. "But why would he come here now? He can't possibly think I'll change my mind, can he?" She bit her lip when she saw Griffin's face tighten. "Mercy, the reason it took me so long to return home this time, and the reason it took me so long to come to you here, is because Samuel Hartwell thinks he succeeded in having me killed." He delivered this news with studied calm, holding her gaze with his as if hoping to lessen the blow. She could see the tender concern fill his eyes as he stood in front of her. She looked at the gash above those eyes and felt the tickle of her tears. She hadn't realized she'd begun to cry. "He tried to kill you because of me." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Mercy." Her brother used the same voice he'd used when she was small and wounded and wailing in his arms, but this hurt felt too big for that. "Listen to me, little sister," he continued, but was interrupted before he could say more. "It wasn't your fault." Wade had stood, although he'd only taken a few steps toward her. He didn't look at her like she was shameful. She wasn't altogether sure what that look in his eyes meant, but he was fierce and steady and as focused as she'd ever seen him. "It's not your fault that Snake tried to kill your brother in order to make you an easy target. It isn't your fault he spread those lies. It's not your fault, Miss Mays, and it's not your shame." She looked back and forth between Wade and her brother for a moment, relaxing when Griffin sent her a crooked grin. "I'm mending just fine," he said. She nodded, a wan smile finally emerging. Sheriff Brody cleared his throat. "Miss Mays, I meant what I told you before. I'll be on hand for anything you need until the matter is resolved." The sheriff and deputy marshal moved toward the door. Wade hesitated, looking between Mercy and Griffin. Sheriff Brody glanced back at him. "Wade, I'd like it if you came to my office and discussed some plans with us." Wade nodded, giving Mercy one long, last, unreadable look that made her heart race. Then he was gone. "Mercy," Griffin began once they were alone, "perhaps it would be best if you stayed at the boarding house for the next few days. Avoid being alone when possible." She nodded, the reality of the danger finally sinking in. "Of course." "I'll be staying there as well," Griffin added. "I've already arranged for a room. If you need to leave the boarding house, I want you accompanied at all times, both to and from the schoolhouse." A grumpy note entered his tone. "Sheriff Brady assures me Mr. Whittle is willing to help ensure you're not alone when I can't be with you." "What did you think of him?" Mercy asked, aiming for a casual tone and missing by a mile. Griffin offered her his arm as they began walking toward town. Straightforward, solid, not a man to waste words. He glanced at her. "He seems concerned for your welfare." "He's been kind," Mercy said carefully. "The whole town has, really." Griffin was quiet for a moment, his stride matching hers. "He doesn't seem like the type to be bothered by your inheritance," he said finally, "or to covet it for that matter." Mercy felt her cheeks warm. "Griffin, that's hardly, we're not—" Her voice stumbled to a stop. "I know," he said, raising his free hand in surrender. "Just an observation, though I can't say I'm entirely pleased with his lack of clear intentions toward you either. Not sure I'll approve of him when he finally does come courting." That grumpy tone was back in his voice. "Griffin!" she exclaimed again, mortified even though she knew he was teasing her to lighten the mood. "Mostly," he laughed, the sound warming her heart despite her embarrassment. "Don't bring out your scoldy schoolmarm voice," he continued teasing. "I suppose I'd have found it a larger fault if he'd shown too much interest as well. Big brother's prerogative." She shook her head, but couldn't help smiling. "You're impossible." His expression sobered. "I'm sorry I wasn't there, Mercy. When Hartwell started his campaign against you, I should have been there to protect you." "You were working," she said softly, "and I'm not a child anymore. I made my own choices." "Brave ones," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm proud of you, little sister. Never doubt that." They walked slowly, and the simple walk with the brother she'd not seen in so long soothed Mercy's frayed nerves. As they approached the boarding house, Griffin squeezed her arm gently. "You're not alone in this, Mercy," he said. "We'll face whatever comes together." That night she lay in bed, a sliver of moonlight casting a soft glow on her coverlet. Mrs. Peabody had been happy to find a room for Griffin, each retreating to their rooms rather than eat with the other boarders. Griffin thought it best not to advertise his presence in town, not wanting Hartwell to hear news of him when he arrived. Mercy shivered, though she was warm enough under her covers. Her mind kept replaying the day's revelations. What if someone was hurt because of her again? "Please, Lord, Her prayer was a lonely whisper in the night. Keep us all safe. See us through the coming trial. She knew Wade had been right earlier. The sins of Samuel Hartwell were not her fault. She let out a weary sigh, but this foolish habit of claiming blame that didn't belong to her was an old one. Even if she hadn't learned to defeat it yet, she was well versed in ignoring it. Most of the time, at least. And tonight there was something far more intriguing that might occupy her thoughts. Wade had never looked at her quite as he had when he left the schoolhouse tonight. I wonder what it was I saw in his eyes, she thought, and the memory had her biting her lip in contemplation. Had it only been this afternoon when she'd worried she imagined his interest in her? I don't think it was my imagination, she thought decisively, turning onto her side and finally letting her eyes drift closed. But it was only a moment before her eyes popped open and she flipped to her other side, staring out into the room again with a frown and a wrinkled brow. But his words aren't proof of anything, really. He might have only been being kind. She was filled with vexation at her unruly thoughts. I rather think I need to use my scoldy schoolmarm voice on myself. This last thought sent her flopping onto her back in frustration. Where was Wade now? Back at his ranch? Or somewhere in town, still planning and preparing with the sheriff? She felt peace steal through her. She didn't know the deputy marshal, but the sheriff was a competent man. I have utter faith in your will, Lord, and I know the strength of Griffin's abilities, the thoroughness of Wade's careful planning. Thank you for surrounding me with such steady protectors. This prayer was a silent whisper in her soul, and she finally drifted off to sleep. But shadowy hands reached for her in her dreams, and as she ran from them, Wade seemed to be just ahead of her, always beyond her reach. Chapter 8. The night stretched deep and silent over Whittler's ranch. In his carpentry workshop off the barn, Wade Whittle moved, restless as the shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Sleep had eluded him, his mind too full of the day's revelations, of Mercy's story, of the danger stalking her. He ran a calloused hand along the edge of his workbench, meticulously straightening tools that were already in perfect order. The familiar scent of sawdust and pine shavings usually brought him peace, but tonight it offered no comfort. She's had to bear too much alone, he muttered to the empty room, wincing as he remembered the stricken look when Griffin offered his own stark news. That skunk tried to kill her brother, make her vulnerable, make her his. The thought had his teeth clenching so fierce his jaw ached. The sheriff's words echoed in his mind. I need you to keep escorting her, Wade. Morning and evening. Griffin thinks it best if he stays out of sight for now. Hartwell believes him dead, and that gives us an advantage. Wade had nodded his agreement, but something in him had frozen when Tom Brady added, She'll need more than just an escort, you know. She'll need someone to stand beside her. His friend's meaning had been clear. Wade's fists tightened at the memory of how he'd simply turned and walked away. The look in Mercy's eyes as he'd left the schoolhouse haunted him now. Her eyes had been puzzled, still wet with tears, though no more had fallen since the first. Coward, he growled at himself, picking up a rasp only to set it down again with unnecessary force. He'd spent the past week watching her, noticing the shy glances she cast his way when she thought he wasn't looking, the soft smile that would appear when he arrived at the schoolhouse each afternoon. All the while he'd kept his distance, maintained his guard. And for what? He thought bitterly. Fear? Wade braced his hands against the workbench, head bowed. I've already failed her, he whispered. She deserves a better man than me. The confession fell into the silence of the workshop. He remembered Griffin's protective stance, the way the Pinkerton had been a steady presence. It was good the other man was here, that he'd survived and Mercy hadn't had to suffer more loss. And it was good he was here to comfort her. because all I did was state the obvious. He knew that last thought wasn't quite true. He'd seen his words settle over her, watched a moment of peace break through that tortured shame in her eyes as the tension began to drain from her shoulders. But then he'd just left her there with her brother, left her with a question forming in her eyes and tears still drying on her cheeks. He'd sworn never to follow his father's path, never to let emotion cloud judgment, never to love so deeply that loss could destroy him as it had destroyed his mother. But Mercy, gentle, determined Mercy, with her ink-stained fingers and her fierce heart, had somehow slipped past every defense. "I love her," he said aloud, the words strange and powerful in the quiet workshop. "Lord, I don't think I care if it hurts me anymore." The prayer trailed off before it fully started. Prayers were hard to come by when a man was too stubborn for repentance. "I don't care if it hurts me," he thought, "but I can't let it hurt her." Seeking distraction from the tumult in his chest, Wade reached for a small block of pine and his whittling knife. His hands needed something to do while his mind tumbled about. He began to carve without conscious thought, the blade making soft scraping sounds against the wood. The moon climbed higher as he worked, his fingers remembering a skill long neglected. The knife moved with sure strokes, shaving away curls of pine to reveal something hidden within. Only when the shape began to emerge did Wade realize what he was creating. A tiny rocking horse took form beneath his hands, its curves smooth and inviting, just the right size for a toddler's grasp. Wade stared at it, lost for a moment in the implications of what his hands had created, without his mind's direction. A child's toy, a father's gift. A reluctant smile tugged at his mouth. "Not everything you taught me hurt, did it, Pa? Grandpa taught me everything I know about carpentry, but it was you who taught me to whittle." Wade sighed. Maybe if a fool forgave his father, he'd stumble into repentance. He turned the small horse over, running his thumb along its rounded back. Had he ever, before that night after dinner, wondered what it would be like? A home filled with more than just his solitary presence. A home filled with children, with family, with love. Maybe it's time to find out just what kind of courage a fool can muster when he stops being too scared to love, he said firmly, tucking the tiny rocking horse into his pocket. A prayer of repentance was ready on his lips as he saddled his horse. He'd never bothered to avoid Sunday services, but he had ignored his Bible and his Savior for far too long. "But I can't go riding into trouble expecting to protect her on my own, Lord," he prayed silently. "I'm glad you've already promised to forgive when we're ready to repent." He continued to pray as he rode toward town, though dawn was still hours away. He would wait, if need be. He would pray through the remainder of the night. Wade would be there when Mercy emerged from the boarding house in the morning. He would walk her to the schoolhouse as the sheriff had requested, but this time he would not remain silent. This time he would tell Mercy Mays that he loved her. "Lord," he whispered, "help me be worthy of her. Help me protect her. Help me love her as she deserves to be loved." The tiny wooden horse pressed against his chest, a small promise of the future he now dared to hope for. Chapter 9. Mercy dressed with care the next morning, choosing her blue calico dress with the small white flowers. Edie had always said it brought out the green in her eyes. Not that she was dressing for anyone in particular, she told herself, unconvincingly, as she pinned her hair. When she entered the boarding house dining room, her heart gave a peculiar little leap. Wade Whittle sat at her usual table, hat resting beside him, deep in conversation with Mrs. Peabody. "I'm mighty glad you run a restaurant out of your kitchen," he was saying, his voice carrying that familiar gruff warmth. "I'm right tired of my own cooking." Mrs. Peabody chuckled, clearly pleased. "Well now, Mr. Whittle, I'll fetch you a proper plate. Can't have one of Broken Acre's finest ranchers going hungry." As the landlady bustled away, Wade's eyes found Mercy's, and he sent her a conspiratorial wink that set her pulse racing. There was something different about him this morning, a softness around his eyes, an ease in his posture that hadn't been there before. "Good morning, Mr. Whittle," she said, sliding into the chair across from him. "Thought I'd escort you to school," he replied, his eyes never leaving her face. "Figured we might as well start with breakfast." There was a new tenderness in his gaze that made her breath catch. Was it possible? She couldn't help the small flutter in her chest. Mrs. Peabody returned with Wade's breakfast, eggs, bacon, and biscuits with gravy, and set a similar plate before Mercy. "You both eat up now," she instructed. "Nothing worse than facing a day on an empty stomach." They ate in companionable silence for a few moments before Mercy gathered her courage. "Thank you," she said softly. "For escorting me, I mean." "No need for thanks," Wade cut in gently. His hand moved across the table, not quite touching hers, but close enough that she could feel the warmth. "It's where I want to be." The simple statement made her cheeks warm. She ducked her head, focusing on her breakfast, but couldn't help stealing glances at him throughout the meal. "Do I see what I think I see?" she wondered, seeing the steady warmth in his brown eyes. Still, she hesitated to hope for too much. When they finished eating, Wade helped her with her shawl, his fingers lingering briefly at her shoulders. The slight touch sent a shiver through her. The air outside was crisp and clear, the sky a brilliant blue overhead. They walked slowly toward the schoolhouse, Wade matching his stride to hers. "I'm glad you got an early start today," he observed, glancing down at her. "I need to finish grading an arithmetic lesson," she explained. "The children are struggling with fractions." Wade chuckled softly. "I'm glad for selfish reasons," he said, his voice dropping to a lower, more intimate tone. "Because there's something I need you to know." Mercy's breath caught. She stopped walking, turning to face him. They stood there together just outside the schoolyard fence. "Yes?" she prompted him. Wade's eyes held hers, deep and serious. "Mercy, Teacher." The excited shouts of children interrupted whatever Wade had been about to say. Billy Morrison came running up, followed by several other students, all clamoring for Mercy's attention. She glanced apologetically at Wade, who gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Later," he murmured just for her ears. "We'll talk later." Throughout the morning, Mercy was acutely aware of Wade's presence, not at all surprised to see he chose to remain. It was like him. It was like him, too, to find 100 tiny tasks to perform as an excuse, each one practical and each one hardly necessary. He moved about the schoolyard, examining the roof he'd already repaired, adding more logs to the overflowing supply. It's going to be a warm winter, she thought, suppressing a chuckle as the children worried over their slates. She continued to watch him throughout the morning. There was a comfortable rhythm to his movements, a quiet competence that spoke of years of physical labor. When he caught her watching, he tipped his hat with a small smile that sent warmth spreading through her. She was almost so distracted by the handsome rancher that she put her worry over Samuel Hartwell clean away, but after lunch, Mercy noticed a wrinkle of worry cross Wade's brow as he looked in through the window. She frowned slightly, fear rising like bile in her throat. His expression cleared when he caught her eye, and he offered her a reassuring smile. When the final bell rang and the children gathered their things, Wade was waiting by the door. There was a vigilance in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He watched the children solemnly as they dispersed. "Is everything all right?" she asked quietly as she gathered her things. Wade hesitated, then stepped closer, his voice low. "Hartwell's men have been spotted in town," he said. They've been asking questions, spreading rumors. Mercy tensed, her fingers tightening around her books. She didn't need to ask what kind of rumors they were spreading. But don't you worry. His eyes were grim, even as his tone remained gentle. Your brother and the sheriff are keeping an eye on them. She nodded, drawing a deep breath to steady herself. Thank you for telling me. Wade's hand came to rest briefly on her shoulder, a warm, reassuring weight. I won't let them hurt you, he said, his voice carrying a fierce certainty that made her believe him. Together they walked out into the schoolyard, Wade's presence solid beside her. But as they reached the gate, Mercy froze. A well-dressed man stood in the center of the town square, surrounded by a growing crowd of townspeople. Samuel Hartwell had found her. He was taller than she remembered, his dark hair slicked back beneath an expensive hat, his suit immaculate despite the dust of travel. His features might have been handsome if not for the cold calculation in his eyes as they fixed on her. Ah, there she is, Hartwell called out, his voice carrying across the square. My dear wife, at last. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Mercy could see faces in the crowd she'd come to count as friends. Abel Morrison standing with his arms crossed, Agatha Hutchins with her mouth drawn into a tight line, Mrs. Stettler, whose slight nod of greeting just yesterday had felt like such progress. Your wife? Someone in the crowd echoed. Hartwell stepped forward, his smile not reaching his eyes. Indeed, my beloved Mercy, who fled in a moment of deep distress. He spread his hands in a gesture of magnanimity. But I understand, my dear, you were trying to protect my reputation from the rumors that I was a fool for marrying my seductress. The smarmy smile he directed at her made Mercy flinch, as much from disgust as from shock at this new tactic. He'd accused her of seducing him before, but claiming they were already married. This is a new low, Lord. How can he spew such lies? The prayer was silent and fleeting. She knew there'd be many more before this ordeal was over. Mercy felt Wade's hand at her elbow, gently guiding her behind him as he stepped forward. A buzz of whispers swept through the gathered townsfolk. That's not true, Wade said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. Miss Mays is not your wife. Before Hartwell could respond, a young, indignant voice piped up from the crowd. That's right, he's a liar, teacher ain't married. Billy Morrison stood with his fists clenched at his sides, his young face flushed with outrage. Hartwell's expression darkened as he rounded on the child. You dare? But before he could take more than a step toward Billy, a tall figure moved through the crowd with startling speed. Griffin scooped Billy up in one fluid motion, pivoting to deliver a swift kick that sent Hartwell sprawling into the dust. Griffin, Mercy gasped, relief flooding through her at the sight of her brother. He was here. He was safe. Thank you, Father, for keeping him safe. Mercy moved to stand beside Wade. She glanced up, meeting his eyes briefly. His hand came to rest on her shoulder, steady and warm. She watched from Wade's side as Abel Morrison hurried forward, nodding gratefully to Griffin as he reached them. Her eyes darted through the crowd almost fearfully, only to find no one was watching her. No one but Wade, she corrected herself silently, feeling him gently squeeze her shoulder as she looked back up at him, finding strength in those warm, steady eyes. Griffin set Billy down beside his father, who immediately tousled the boy's hair with affectionate pride. Hartwell was struggling to his feet, brushing dust from his expensive trousers and glaring around the square. Griffin just stood and watched him, his stance relaxed but alert. Your men aren't here, he said coolly. His lip curled slightly. Not the lousy shot who failed to kill me or those ex-Pinkertons you hired. At Billy's shocked gasp, Griffin turned his back on Hartwell, his expression softening as he looked at the boy. "They ain't worth the Pinkerton name, son," he assured him, then added with a wink, "But I am." Mercy gasped as Hartwell lunged toward her brother with a wordless grunt of rage. But before she or anyone could scarce shout a word of warning, Griffin, calm as you please, gave a graceful spin and delivered another kick that sent the man right back into the dirt. Samuel Hartwell glared at Griffin, then sent that hateful glare all around the crowd. Mercy tensed when she saw him spot her. "Get your hands off my wife," Hartwell shouted from the ground, his eyes fixed on Wade's hand on Mercy's shoulder. Both Griffin and Wade took a step toward him then, stopping when Abel Morrison's voice rang out clear and strong. "You been trotting out that lie all day, spewing your swill as you go." Abel's weathered face was set in lines of disgust. "Ain't nothing you say match the lady we know." A murmur of agreement rose from the crowd. Mercy looked around, her heart swelling with gratitude. Not every face is a shining beacon of support, she thought. Some seemed confused and others were clearly reserving judgment. But none she'd counted as friends appeared to have given Hartwell's lies a moment's consideration. The crowd parted as Sheriff Brady finally arrived, his expression grim as he took in the scene. "Mr. Hartwell," he said, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun belt, "I believe you and I need to have a conversation. The deputy marshal is quite interested in meeting you." The sheriff gave Mercy a friendly nod as he passed by, marching Hartwell off toward the jailhouse, Griffin trailing leisurely behind. People lingered, talking in small groups, casting curious glances toward Mercy and Wade. She saw Billy looking after her brother with wide, fascinated little eyes and couldn't stop her smile. She let out a tremulous sigh. It was finally over. Wade turned to her then, his hands coming up again to rest gently on her shoulders as he stood before her and held her at arm's length. His eyes searched her face, and what he saw there seemed to please him, for his expression softened into something that made her heart skip. "I've a most important question to ask," he said, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. There was a gentle playfulness in his tone that she'd never heard before. "I'd be much obliged if you'd allow me to call you Mercy. I expect our good neighbors here will start to talk if I keep calling you Miss Mays while I come courting." Abel Morrison snorted, and a few friendly chuckles rippled through the onlookers. Mercy felt a giggle of her own bubbling up, and she nodded, unable to speak past the lump of joy forming in her throat. "Yes," she finally managed, her voice soft but steady. "Yes, Wade, I'd like that very much." The tenderness in his eyes as he looked down at her made her feel as though they were the only two people in the world, despite the crowd of onlookers. "Thank you, Lord," she prayed silently. "When my trouble came, you gave me more than safe refuge." She felt as if her smile would never leave her as she gazed up at Wade. "You gave me a home." Epilogue. Mercy sat at the desk Wade had crafted for her, adding a final few lines to a letter for Edie that was to accompany a blanket for the baby her friend was expecting. The desk was a marvel of smooth oak, fitted perfectly into the cozy nook he'd created near the window. Behind her was a second surprise, a matching bookshelf that held her small collection of books alongside the new volumes that Griffin had given as a wedding gift. She propped her chin in her hands, looking out the window toward the barn, toward the carpentry workshop where she knew he was working tonight. She sighed dreamily as her thoughts drifted back to her wedding day. Wade had stood straight-backed and still as he waited for her, his dark suit pressed, his tie crooked just slightly at the collar. His eyes had been full of tenderness and joy, and a look of such sweet awe that it made her heart stutter in her chest. She had never seen him look at anything the way he looked at her then. But I've seen it countless times since, she thought, a smile filling her heart. With effort, she turned back to her task. filling her dearest friend in on all the current details of her life. The children sang a hymn they had rehearsed in secret, and Billy Morrison declared the day better than Christmas. Mercy smiled as her pen continued its gentle scratching. The memories were precious, still fresh in her mind. After the wedding, the schoolhouse had been transformed. Pine boughs over the windows, paper snowflakes fluttering from the rafters. Callie Morrison had taken the cooking in hand, and nearly every student's household had contributed something. What a tight fit we all made in the schoolroom. But what a joyful celebration. It was not the grand sort of wedding our friends back east would have preferred, but it was mine, and it was perfect. She laid her pen down carefully, reading over the happy words by the light of the gas lamp. She ran her fingertips along the edge of the paper, her thoughts drifting from her wedding day to the unsettled feeling tugging gently at her heart. "Griffin leaves tomorrow," she wrote quickly, as if to escape the pain of their parting. "He rode off after the girl who saved his life, just as soon as my ordeal with Hartwell was over. Her name is Sadie, and I half expected him to bring her back with him when he returned. Maybe I shouldn't speculate, but there was such a light in his eyes when he spoke of her, Edie, and such weary sadness when he returned alone. Will you and Daniel join me in prayer for him? I fear the look in his eyes if this new lead is a hollow hope. Pray for his safety, but also for peace to accompany whatever Providence has in store for them." A short time later, Mercy signed and folded the letter, then tied it with a ribbon, slipping it carefully into an envelope. Soft steps sounded just beyond the sitting room, and she turned, already smiling. Wade stood there, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, boots abandoned near the hearth. The warm lamplight played across the angles of his face, his dark eyes quietly watching her. My husband is still undeniably an arresting figure of a man, she thought, echoing the notion that had accompanied their first meeting in the schoolroom. He answered her smile with his own, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Finished that letter to Edie yet?" Wade asked as he entered, his voice carrying that teasing note she'd grown to love. "At the rate you're going, the baby will be born and walking before your letter and gifts arrive." Mercy laughed. "I've just finished." She spied something behind his back. "What are you hiding there?" He brought out his hands with twinkling eyes. "A gift for you to send along to Edie," Wade said, holding an alphabet block in each hand. The blocks were meticulously carved. One had a letter M, while the other had a W beautifully etched into the sides. Mercy reached out and traced one. "They're wonderful," she said, meeting his eyes. "I stained and sealed them with the same walnut husks and beeswax I used on your rocking horse," he murmured, moving to set the blocks on her desk before returning to her side and pulling her close. "The rest are drying in the workshop with the box I made for them." "I didn't know you were making Edie a gift," she said, pulling slightly back to look up at him. "It's practice," he said, punctuating the words with a fleeting feather-light kiss against her lips, "for when we have our own children." He captured her lips in another kiss, slow and deep and filled with infinite tenderness. "I believe you're going to spoil our children even more fiercely than you do their mother," Mercy said when she caught her breath, eyeing the tiny rocking horse that he'd presented to her the night he proposed. It sat in prized position on the bookshelf, an ever-present declaration of his love for her. Wade laughed softly, pressing a brief kiss on top of her head, then resting his cheek against her hair. "They'll still turn out all right. Their mama's got a fine scoldy schoolmarm voice that will keep them in line." I hope you loved Wade and Mercy and their journey together as much as I did. Please subscribe for more stories. I hope you'll join me again for Sadie and Griffin's story, coming soon. Good night to you all, and may God bless you and keep you as you continue your own journeys through His grace. This video was narrated by ElevenLabs. Check out their link in the description below.
My eyes lift to the hills, where is my help? My help hails from the maker of all heaven and earth. My helper is the Lord. My eyes rise